Throughout the mid-1900s, workers had to face harsh conditions and extreme amounts of unfair treatment from the people and companies they worked for. They were overlooked by employers and their needs and wants were disregarded. However, a group called the United Automobile Workers Union, UAW, created conflict by organizing the Flint sit-down strike in order to improve their working environment and stand up to the overpowering General Motor Company, GM.
These were days when history changed its course. The sit-down strikes began on December 30th. They began with the attempt of GM to move the dies at Fisher No. 1 to Grand Rapids and elsewhere.
The United Automobile Workers Union, UAW, had been trying to resolve issues concerning pay and working conditions through negotiations with the General Motor Company, their employer, for months, with no success. Consequently, the union decided to try a more aggressive approach to the situation that would force direct confrontation with the company. The Flint sit-down strike proved to be the right approach and ultimately led to the compromise between the UAW and GM. Although many factors contributed to their success, their well-thought-out and developed strategy was the primary component that gained labor unions recognition from their employers and eventually led workers to gain the fair conditions they work under today. GM was a huge company, owning around 43% of the U.S. automobile industry. With that, they had very high expectations for production and gave little care to opinions and struggles of their workers. Workers were paid based on their productivity, which pushed them to work quickly even more. To add to their stress, the conditions of their assembly line were absolutely horrendous. The workers in the plant would be completely exhausted from the whole draining process. One even stated that his hands were so swollen he couldn't get his fingers between each other. They worked in the hot of the summer and the cold of the winter. Sometimes workers would not even get breaks to use the bathroom, as stated by Geraldine Blankenship, who was a young girl among this whole event.
It was hard work before the strike. It was very, very hot. There were people who were dropping over because of the heat, and the other workers were told, just step over them until we can get them out of the way. I think that's one thing that really helped bring on the strike. It was such an inhumane, thing to do. It was terrible.
In addition to this, they were only paid an average income of $900, while the government states that $1,600 was the minimum income for a family of 4 to live on. Workers could not even support their families with such little pay. To try to protest these conditions, workers would form unions where they would come up with ideas to improve their working status. GM put strict limitations to ensure that workers would not unionize. They even hired spies to work in the plant and look out for any suspicious union-like activity. Once the workers decided they could not put up with GM any longer, they decided to form the UAW. In the mid-1936s, the union only had about 100 members out of thousands in the city. A good amount among these were deemed to be spies for the company. Wyndham Mortimer put in his best efforts to try to gain members in a non-conventional way. He went to each door of every single home with an auto worker. This proved to be an efficient strategy because he could keep the organization secretive. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, was passed by President Franklin Roosevelt. This act ensured workers the right to form labor unions and bargain collectively. Because of this, many workers in the automobile industry took the opportunity to join the UAW, otherwise known as the United Automobile Workers Union. Another factor that led to the Flint sit-down strike was the Great Depression. Due to the Great Depression and its influences, many workers were losing their jobs, and the workers who still had their jobs were being paid less and less and forced to work longer hours under poor conditions. The jobs of a union is to improve working conditions for laborers, and the UAW faced a strong and stubborn employer, so they decided to organize a strike in order to gain their rights. The workers in Flint, Michigan knew that they had a long and difficult road ahead of them. The UAW picked the specific Flint factory to perform their strike at because it was where the dye used to color the cars was produced.
Without the dye plant, no cars that were already built could be sold. This strategy proved to be very effective in winning the strike. Furthermore, on December 30th, 1936, the strike began. Workers at General Motor Company refused to leave until fairer conditions and better pay was given. Some used more aggressive approaches than others. They even parked cars around the building and threw car parts at the police in order to prevent them from interfering. When General Motor Company first heard the news, the owner refused to get involved. Instead, they cut the heat and electricity in the building, making the conditions unbearable. Despite this, the strikers held strong and refused to submit to the horrible environment. Instead, Bob Travis and Roy Ruther, who were considered leaders, organized several groups that all contributed to the success of the strike. For example, there were committees established that managed security, cleaning, entertainment, etc. They received a lot of help from outside sources as well.
They had their own Women's Emergency Brigade, which was comprised of female GM workers in addition to wives of workers participating in the strike. The Emergency Women's Brigade significantly helped members of the strike by making food in union kitchens and also occasionally doing picket duty. On January 11th, the police attempted to cut off the workers' food supply by blocking the entrances, which caused great violence to take place. The police fired tear gas and buckshot at the strikers, who in turn launched car parts and shot water at them. The riot caused many workers and police to be injured, and the National Guard was summoned to break the strike. However, Frank Murphy, the city's governor, stopped short in ordering them to forcefully break the strike since he could understand the workers' cause. The strike went on for 44 days and was supported by millions of automobile workers all throughout the country, in addition to having led to several other strikes that took place later.
Due to an extreme decrease in automobile production, the General Motors Company eventually subjected to compromise on February 11, 1937. Originally, the governor wanted to evict the strikers, but CIO President John L. Lewis convinced him otherwise. Governor Murphy declared that the strikers could stay in their plants, resulting in GM settling with the UAW. GM President Alfred Sloan finally announced the compromise. The union achieved a 5% increase in their pay, and they were allowed to talk during lunch breaks, in addition to being recognized as the only bargaining agent for GM workers. They agreed that strikers would not be discriminated against, but the workers also had to ensure that the union would not organize another strike. The UAW also had to agree not to consult and recruit members on company grounds. The strike can also be credited with the establishment of the 40-hour work week, which came from an original 48 hours. Although both organizations had to settle in some ways, the overall agreement was both effective and fair. The biggest impact that the UAW had was the increased respect that unions received as a result of the strike. In addition to this, it was found that over the course of the year, the UAW grew from 30,000 to 500,000 members.
Because the union succeeded, many employers started to take their union seriously and listen to what they have to say, as opposed to how they neglected their complaints in the past. The Flint sit-down strike also inspired many others to stand up for their causes and served as a turning point in how workers were treated.
Just 2 weeks after, 87 sit-down strikes were staged in Detroit, and new companies announced wage increases. Several other strikes in the future instigated by this one ended up winning the union some of its most significant benefits, including full health coverage, 90% pay during layoffs, etc. Payment for auto laborers increased by almost 300%.
If the Flint sit-down strike had never taken place, labor unions in the automobile industry would have never been established, and strikes that took place in the future would not have happened. Therefore, many of the benefits workers enjoy today would not have been instated without the Flint sit-down strike.
Overall, auto workers had always faced awful environments and oppressive employers, until the UAW acted out against this. The conflict of the well-planned Flint sit-down strike led to a compromise between the union and General Motors Company. Laborers were able to gain more equal rights and fair conditions. The work of the union through the strike served as a model of industrial employment that has been mirrored all across the United States.